Welcome to the HFY Codex Tale. If you like our videos, keep supporting and subscribe to our channel. The twin moons of Velar 9 hung low in the purple sky. Inside the crystal palace, Thalia, daughter of the ruling house, stood still, jaw tight, hands behind her back. The high chamber buzzed with whispers. Elders in gold robes watched her closely. She already knew why they had called her. She just didn't want to believe it. At the center of the room, the Grand Speaker's voice echoed. Thalia of House Sorrel, your bonding match has been confirmed by the Alliance. Her heart sank. You will meet your suitor tomorrow. Her hands clenched. He is human. The word hit her like a slap. A silent protest. Thalia said nothing, but her eyes flashed with quiet fire. A human, after years of training, sacrifice, and proving her worth. They wanted her to bond with a species known for emotion, chaos, and softness. Her father stepped forward. You must accept this. The council has spoken. And if I refuse, she asked coldly. The Grand Speaker lowered his gaze. You cannot, the pact is sealed. The human has already boarded the envoy ship. Alone in the hall. Later, Thalia walked alone through the long corridors of her home. Crystal lights glowed blue and white, casting patterns on her silver robes. She stopped at a tall window. Stars blinked in the distance. A human. She'd seen their kind at trade conferences. Loud, messy, always smiling too much. She imagined this suitor of hers, probably short, with a strange voice and weak skin. Would he even understand her language, her silence, her pride? She shook her head. He won't last a day. The arrival. The next morning, the station's docking wing was cleared. Only Thalia and two guards stood waiting as the human envoy ship landed. Its door hissed open with steam. Out stepped a tall figure in a dark suit. His posture was straight, his hair dark, his jaw rough and unshaved. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, and didn't look away. Their first words. The guards tensed. Thalia raised her chin, arms crossed. So, you're the one they've chosen for me. And you're the one I was warned about, the human said. His voice was calm, deep, surprisingly steady. She frowned. Warned. They said you'd be cold, sharp-tongued, hard to impress. And you're not impressed. He smiled slightly. I am, but I won't say it yet. Something unexpected. There was silence. She was used to men trying too hard. Alien princes with long speeches and glowing gifts, warriors with loud laughs and fake strength. But this human stood still. He didn't flinch. He didn't try to charm. He just looked at her, really looked, like he was trying to see something deeper. And for a second, she felt seen. Not as a symbol, not as a bondmate. As a person. That night, alone in her room, Thalia stared into the mirror. She touched her own face gently, confused. Why had her heart skipped when he looked at her? She had sworn to hate him. So why couldn't she stop thinking about the way his eyes held no fear? The first meal together. The dining hall was quiet. Crystal walls shimmered softly, and a long silver table stretched between Thalia and her human suitor, Evan. Two glowing plates floated between them, filled with steaming dishes from both their worlds. He didn't reach for his food. Neither did she. Why aren't you eating? Thalia asked, breaking the silence. Waiting for you, Evan replied, calm. Humans usually eat quickly, don't they? Loudly, messily. Some do, he said with a small smile. But I was trained for this meal. Thalia narrowed her eyes. You think you're here to impress me. I think I'm here because someone else made a choice, not me. His words hit her like a slow-moving arrow. Testing him, Thalia picked up a bright green root from her plate and bit into it. Let me guess, you're going to tell me I'm beautiful next. Evan looked up, eyes steady. No. She froze. Why not? Because I don't know you, not yet. Thalia felt a flicker in her chest. Was that surprise? She had expected flattery. Instead, she got honesty. And it unsettled her more than a compliment ever could. Poking the fire, she leaned forward, cold and direct. You must think this is a great chance, bonding with a royal, a woman from a strong race. No, he said quietly. I think it's terrifying. Terrifying because I don't want to be chosen like a tool. I want to be wanted, or not at all. Her breath caught. The unseen truth. Thalia said nothing. She stared at her plate. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with anger, not with charm, but with truth. Not even her own people. You look like someone who's used to being looked at, Evan added, but not seen. She blinked, lips parting slightly. You don't know me. Not yet, he said again. Then he picked up a small, glowing spoon and took a bite of her planet's most bitter root. He didn't flinch. Strong flavor, he said. She smirked just barely. That night back in her chamber, Thalia stood near the window. For once her thoughts weren't sharp, they were quiet. Confused. She had expected a human to beg, to bow, to brag. But he didn't. And now she wasn't sure who was testing who anymore. She tests his limits. The next day, Thalia entered the training dome with a sharp purpose. The artificial sky above was painted red, the same hue used in warrior simulations. In the center of the dome stood Evan, stretching his arms and rolling his shoulders. He looked relaxed. That annoyed her. Let's see how calm he is after this, she thought. We're running the sand trial, she said aloud. Evan glanced at her, wiping his forehead. That the one where everything tries to kill you? Exactly, don't fall behind. The trial begins. The sand trial was a harsh desert simulation used to train Veleri soldiers. Gravity was heavier, the winds were hot, and the terrain shifted constantly. Only bonded elites completed it without injury. Thalia moved quickly, her body trained, her breathing sharp. Behind her, she expected to hear human footsteps stumble or slow. But Evan was right behind her. No complaints. No fear. Just focused breathing. He's keeping up. The heat test. They reached the cliff. Beneath it, glowing sand pits and jumping lava bugs. Fast, fiery creatures that stunned with a sting. This is where most humans quit, she said. Evan looked down, then at her. Are you trying to scare me off? Would it work? He smirked. Try harder. Before she could stop him, he jumped. The surprise. Thalia leapt after him, her heart pounding, not from fear but something else. He landed hard but rolled smoothly, already dodging a lava bug before she touched the ground. He moved differently from other humans, not as strong but careful, smart. He didn't panic. He adapted. The fall. As they ran through the pit, a ledge crumbled. Thalia slipped. Her foot caught between rocks. She growled, trying to pull free, until a blast of sand exploded nearby, pushing her down. Then she felt it. Warm hands grabbed her. Evan. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her up, blocking the next blast with his body. The sand hit his back hard. He gritted his teeth but stayed upright. You okay? He asked. She stared at him, stunned. He was bleeding, breathing hard. But his eyes held no fear. Only concern for her. The moment. Later at the exit gate, she sat beside him in silence. She didn't say thank you. But she didn't walk away either. Why did you do that? She asked finally. What? Put yourself between me and the blast. He shrugged. Reflex, you would have done the same. No, she said quietly. I was trained not to. Then maybe it's time you unlearn that. That night, Thalia stood before the elders. They asked about the trial. Did the human fail? She hesitated, then shook her head. No, she said. He didn't fail. He protected me. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel ashamed to admit it. The warning from her people. The council hall was cold. Its tall walls were carved from starlight crystal, glowing faintly with blue lines. Elders sat in a half circle, their eyes sharp and emotionless. Thalia stood in the center, her hands folded, her face still. But her thoughts were anything but calm. The elder's voice. The Grand Elder's voice echoed. You spent many hours with the human. It was part of the trial, she replied. Another elder leaned forward. And did he act emotional? He acted human, she said carefully. The elders looked at each other. Be careful, Thalia, the Grand Elder warned. This bond is political, a treaty, nothing more. I know. No feelings, no closeness. He is not your equal. He is a symbol, a message of peace. And if I disagree, then you are not ready for leadership. Alone again. Later in her private chamber, Thalia paced the floor. She had always followed orders, always honored duty. But now her mind was full of things she didn't understand. The way Evan jumped into danger without thinking. The way he looked at her, not as a prize or title, but like he actually saw her. And worst of all, the way she didn't hate it. The music box. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened a small glass case. Inside was a broken Velari music crystal, a gift from her mother, silent for years. Evan had seen it once. She never told him what it was. Just called it junk. But now it was glowing. She picked it up. The crystal played softly. No, he didn't, she whispered. He fixed it. She stared at the crystal, hands trembling. He had touched something personal. He had respected it. No big speech, no showing off. Just quiet care. The shift. Thalia looked at her reflection in the glass. She didn't see a royal figure. She didn't see a warrior. She saw a girl who was beginning to feel things she wasn't allowed to feel. Why does this hurt? She whispered. He's just human. But deep inside, she already knew. He was more than that. At that very moment, Evan was standing on the outer deck, staring at the twin moons. He didn't know she was watching him from above. He just stood quietly, arms folded, head tilted toward the stars. He looked peaceful and alone, just like her. And that's when she realized he might be the only one on this planet who understands what it feels like to never truly belong. The attack on the station. The sky turned red. Not from sunset. From warning lights. The sound of alarms echoed through the great halls of the Velari Palace. Thalia froze mid-step as the walls around her began to shake. What's happening? She shouted at a nearby guard. Enemy ship, it's House Tyron, they've broken the treaty. Why would they attack now? To stop the human bond. If it succeeds, your house becomes untouchable. The station trembles. Evan was in the training yard when the blast hit. He barely had time to dodge falling debris as the ground cracked beneath him. Guards shouted, people ran, but he didn't move with them. Instead, he turned toward the palace. Where is she? He ran. Trapped, Thalia was rushing toward the command room when another explosion tore through the floor. The ceiling caved in. She fell, trapped beneath a heavy beam, her leg pinned. She tried to pull free, but the pain shot through her body like fire. Her calm was broken. Smoke filled the corridor. And then footsteps. Someone was coming. She braced herself for an enemy. But then, Thalia. Her eyes widened. Evan. He came for her. He rushed through the smoke, coughed hard, and saw her under the beam. No words. No hesitation. He dropped to his knees and grabbed the beam with both hands. Don't, she said. It's too heavy. Then I'll break my back trying. He pushed, muscles strained. Blood trickled from his arms. And somehow the beam moved. Thalia gasped and pulled herself out. You idiot, she whispered. He laughed breathlessly. Nice to see you too. Their escape. He helped her up, arm around her shoulders. Her legs shook, but she leaned on him. The hallway collapsed behind them. He didn't ask questions. He just kept moving forward, carrying her when she couldn't walk. Every turn, every blast, he shielded her. No fear. No orders. Just raw will. Safe for now. An emergency drone picked them up and brought them to a med shelter outside the palace. Thalia's wounds were treated. She sat on the bed, silent, watching Evan. His uniform was torn, his face was bruised. But he still stood straight, still looked at her the same way he always did. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why what? Why risk yourself like that?" He sat beside her and didn't smile this time. "Because when I saw that beam fall, I didn't see a duty. I saw you." She stared at him, her breath caught in her chest. This human, this strange, calm, stubborn human, had become something she didn't know how to describe. She looked down, her voice soft. "You could have let me die." "Yeah," he said quietly. "But then I'd have to live without you." And for the first time, Thalia looked into his eyes and didn't look away. The truth in his eyes. The medical bay was silent. All the noise from the attack, the alarms, the fire, the shouting was gone. Only soft lights glowed above, casting gentle shadows across Evan's face. He had fallen asleep in the chair beside Thalia's bed, one arm wrapped in a healing brace. His breathing was slow, calm. She hadn't taken her eyes off him for over an hour. The quiet shift. Thalia had been trained her whole life to guard her heart. No weakness, no tears, no bonds that could break her. But now, as she watched him sleep, bruised and peaceful, she felt something rising in her chest that no training could stop. Not fear, not confusion, softness. She reached forward and touched his hand. "He wakes." Evan opened his eyes slowly, saw her fingers resting on his. He didn't pull away. He didn't speak. Just looked at her, his gaze soft and still. And in that moment she saw it. The truth. Not in his words. Not in his strength. In his eyes. The conversation she didn't expect. "Why are you like this?" she whispered. "Like what?" "You keep risking yourself. You never ask for anything. You look at me like I'm real." He smiled faintly. "Because you are. I wasn't supposed to care about you." "But you do." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The honest confession. Evan sat up, voice low. "I was scared of you when we met." "Why?" she asked. "Because you looked like someone who never got to be soft. Like someone who was always watched, but never truly seen." Thalia blinked fast. Her throat felt tight. No one had ever said something like that. Not even her own blood. She looked away, but he reached out, just gently, and touched her hand again. "You don't have to carry all of it alone." Later that night, she stood outside under the twin moons, cloak wrapped around her shoulders. The stars were quiet. She thought about the elders, the duty, the warnings, but all she could hear was his voice. "You looked like someone who never got to be soft." A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away, because for once in her life, she wanted to be seen. The bond she chose herself. The grand chamber was full. Valeri nobles, soldiers, diplomats, even off-world guests, all gathered under the great glass dome. The war was over, but something far more important was about to happen. The ceremonial bond speech. And all eyes were on Thalia. She stood tall in her silver robes, but unlike before, her face wasn't guarded. She looked calm, clear, decided. Next to her stood Evan, in simple black clothing, hands behind his back. He didn't look like a warrior. He didn't act like a prince. He just stood there steady and waiting. For her, the elders speak. The Grand Elder raised his hand. "Princess Thalia, as planned, the human suitor stands beside you. Do you accept this bond as commanded? For duty, for treaty, for the strength of the Empire." Everyone waited. Thalia turned toward Evan. He didn't nod. He didn't plead. He just looked into her eyes. And that was all she needed. Her voice. She turned back to the council. Took a deep breath. "I was born into duty. Trained for strength. Taught to obey. But none of you ever asked what I felt, what I needed." Murmurs echoed across the hall. But she continued. You chose Evan for me. But today I tell you. She reached for his hand. He took it gently, like he had from the beginning. I choose him too. Silence. No one spoke. Even the elder council, so powerful, so ancient, sat frozen. Then one elder stood. He is not of our kind. No, Thalia replied, but he saw my heart before any of you did. He protected me, not because of duty, but because he wanted to. The reaction. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, the Queen Mother slowly rose. Eyes glistening, she walked forward and bowed to her daughter. Then let this bond be remembered not as command, but as choice. The room erupted in soft applause. Later, that night on the upper balcony of the palace, Thalia and Evan stood together. Below, the lights of Veller 9 shimmered like stars. So, he said, was I really that bad at first? She smiled gently. You were strange, quiet, always calm. And now, she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Your mind. Final words. In a galaxy full of power, rules, and titles. She had found something no council could assign. A connection. A choice. A love that saw her, not as a princess, but as herself. White heavy check marked the end.